Okay, we are ready to record. This is for John 8 and 9. This video is supplementary to week number 4 in Johannine Writings for Trinity Baptist College. And this week you'll be reading from John chapters 7 through 10 in that gospel. And there's a lot of stuff going on, so I'm just going to focus on two things in John chapters 8 and 9, the problem of sin and the problem of evil. The problem of sin and the problem of evil. First, we're going to talk about the problem of sin. You're going to see this primarily in the story from John 7:53 through chapter 8, verse 11. It's the woman taken in adultery. Some worry that John 7:53 through 8:11 is not authentic since it does not appear in many manuscripts. Go ahead and read Elmer Towns for more on that. I think that's very interesting. He can even point you to other resources. For instance, I can recommend D.A. Carson, his commentary on the Gospel of John. You can just Google that or put that into Amazon. It's excellent. And also Andreas Kostenberger, who is a scholar in residence here at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, where I'm located now. He wrote a book called Encountering John, and he talks about this issue and a lot of issues as well. So I definitely recommend those two books for you. So let's look at this. And a question presents itself in the problem of sin here with the woman caught in adultery. I'm assuming that you've read the narrative or you're familiar with it. Why could Jesus ignore the law? I mean, she was caught in adultery, right? So she needed to be put to death. Why did Jesus get to ignore the law? It can't be because he's God and therefore anything he does is right. That just assumes something called theological voluntarism, where God would just get to decide to do whatever he wanted. If he decided that murder was okay, then it would be okay. Where that sounds pretty terrible. If he decided that torturing babies for fun was a good idea, then it's a good idea. And we're thinking that that's not even possible, that God is a much more perfect being than that. So Jesus couldn't just ignore the law. That's why I put the word ignore in quotes, because, in fact, he didn't ignore it. He wasn't ignoring it. In fact, the law said that both the man and the woman were to be stoned, or they were to be put to death. And in context, in verse 24, it talks about stone. So I think most plausibly they would have been put to death by stoning. That's where I differ a little bit from Dr. Christmas. But where was the man? He wasn't there, was he? Or at least not that we know of. They presented the woman. So here's the next part. This is why some think that either the woman was not in adultery at all. So think about it, caught in the very act. It's a little awkward. But, it doesn't seem very likely. The woman wasn't caught in adultery at all, but I think she probably was because Jesus told her not to sin anymore. She never really proclaimed that she was innocent of that charge. Or else maybe one of the scribes or Pharisees was the man involved. Now that's an interesting twist, isn't it? Where was the man? Well, maybe she was a local woman of the night, so to speak, and one of these scribes or Pharisees decided to visit her, and then they thought, oh, I've got a brilliant idea. I'm going to turn this on Jesus and just kind of stay out of it. And maybe this was a collusion that all the scribes and Pharisees that were involved that day knew about. And that would have been very interesting. Perhaps the writing that Jesus did in the sand was something like, thou shalt not bear false witness. Perhaps it was, I will desire mercy and not sacrifice. It could be any number of things, but I think there was some element of deception or insincerity going on because the man was not present. So Jesus is fulfilling the letter of the law, but he's not concerned about the letter of the law as much as he's concerned about the spirit of the law. So even though he's not breaking the law at all, he's also fulfilling it. He's showing, hey, look, these, mercy is part of the law. That's just going to be there. But also, thou shalt not bear false witness. That's part of the law. So I'm not real definite on what Jesus was writing, and it's not as important to see that he was writing. We'll see what the true importance of this whole section was in a moment. It's the problem of sin. In any case, the problem of sin is one that affects us all. We don't get out of saying that we're guiltless. Like, we can't just say, oh yeah, we're guiltless, no problem, let me just extricate myself from the problem of sin. We don't get out of that. We're stuck in it. But that leads us to the problem of evil. Because we've been talking about sin here, But now let's look at and see John chapter 9. Jesus desires mercy. God desires mercy. And yet we see all of these bad things happening to people, some of which is a consequence of sin. So sometimes sin, it does receive some serious consequences, physical consequences. So what kind of questions does that bring up? Well, John 9 raises an interesting question. Since sin is a problem and does have consequences, who sinned so that this man was born blind? That's what the disciples ask. And we can try to be hard on him, but let's face facts. Sometimes physical consequences or punishments do follow from sinful actions, and we can see that in everyday life. Let's say you're a drunk driver and you get pulled over and you get a ticket. Well, that ticket could be an example of you suffering, but it's you suffering for your own sin, isn't it? Or let's say, unfortunately, there's a drunk driver and he gets in an accident and kills an innocent person in another car. Now, we can say that that innocent person suffered because of the sin of the drunk driver. So you see, this is not totally irrational. The disciples, they are coming from somewhere. But Jesus wants to correct the bad inference from the fact that some physical maladies are from sin to all of them are. That's a bad inference. He's like, no, his parents didn't sin, and he didn't sin that he was born blind. That's a retrocausal view of sin, which is interesting. God knew that you'd sin in the future, therefore he caused you to be born with a deformity of some kind. That's an interesting way of looking at it, but it seems that they did look at it that way. When answering the problem of evil, the problem of why people suffer, why bad things happen, why there's just evil in the world, just morally bad actions, we must be sensitive to people who are hurting. They don't always want to hear an academic answer. They don't always want to hear, well, it's this, and this reason, now go and have a good day. Well, no, they're not. They experienced a traumatic suffering, or they are witnessing evil with their own eyes and they want a real answer. However, when they're ready to hear a more intellectual type of answer, then we need to be there for them. And we need to be there for them even when it's just or mostly an emotional issue. Emotions are still real, and they were really put into us by God. So just as God grieves, we grieve. That we are made in the image of God. So the problem of evil. Now, how do you solve the problem of evil? We can say, well, you see, Jesus solved it for us. He said that suffering happens for God's glory. Okay, but please note, while this was for God's glory, I don't dispute that, any answer to the problem of evil that states God creates people in order to punish them needs to be rethought. Some people say, why are there people, this is called the soteriological problem of evil, and that is, why are there people who are in hell? Why is it the case that not everyone's saved? Some people say God always gets what he wants. God wants everyone to be saved, therefore everyone is saved. Well, that's logically true. You have to, if you affirm both premises in the exact same way, then you have to come up with that conclusion. So the only way out of it, because it does seem to be the case that the Bible teaches that there are those who are not saved, is to go back and deny one of the premises. The issue is, when people answer that question, they say, well, God needed someone on whom to display his wrath. I have two thoughts. One, did he really need that many people to display his wrath on? Because if the Bible is any indication, it at least seems to be the case. Broad is the way that leads to destruction, narrow is the way that leads to righteousness. It at least seems to be the case that more people who are adult moral agents will perish than will hang on and be saved. That will go ahead and embrace the truth of salvation. So, did God need all those people, and precisely those people, in order to display his wrath? Did God really create people in order to condemn them? And that's the other question. We don't want to put a question in the moral character and integrity of God. When we say that if we say that God creates people in order to punish them, what we're really saying is that there's some kind of question about the moral character or integrity of God, where he will use people as mere means to achieve his ends, instead of as ends in themselves, because they are image bearers of God. We're not saying that God owes any obligation to us by any means, but we are saying that whatever the answer is, it can't be because merely God, just needed to go ahead and punish some people. In addition to that, if we want to say that God needed some people on whom to display his wrath, he could display his wrath on the devil and his angels, and that's it, right? So, and even if you say, well, he needs some human persons in there, just, some of each kind, well, then he could have just taken the worst, like Hitler, Stalin. And it won't do to reply back, there is no worst, because Jesus himself affirms that some things are worse than others. Like when you offend a little child, it's better that you, hung a millstone about your neck and cast yourself into the sea. Or where he affirms that, Jesus himself affirms that, certain, Tyre and Sidon will have a better judgment than those who reject the Messiah face to face, that have seen all the works the Messiah has done and still reject him. Why? Because it's worse to be face to face with God himself and reject what he does. That's why. It's not just because of arbitrary punishment scales. So, why couldn't he just take the worst, Hitler or Stalin and a few others, Genghis Khan and a few others throughout history, and punish them and have the rest of us go to heaven, if that's the only reason? So we do recognize it's for God's glory, but there's a further answer. Here's the further answer. Jesus himself further explains how it is that this man brings God glory, not merely in his blindness, but in the works of God. Look at verses 4 through 5. He says, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. He's doing the work of God. Now in verse 3 it says, Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Why were these works done? Because Jesus is the light of the world. This light is the light of salvation. So you see, we must be careful in saying we have the definitive solution to the problem of evil. Even so, it seems as though God desires the salvation of people made in his image. People who, since they are non-divine, will always fail. That is, any created person who is given significant moral freedom and placed in significant moral circumstances where they have to make a choice, given enough time, every last one of them who are non-divine will ultimately fail. But even so, God has provided a way of redemption. And that's something that we have to be excited about. God created us. He saw fit to give us life. But further than that, he didn't just leave us in our despair. He reached out to humanity and sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to pay for the sins of the world, so that whosoever would accept the gospel, would accept that basic gospel message that even a child can understand, will be saved. So I hope you all have a good week. Make sure you email me or contact me with any questions.